Hello, CRCSJ family. It's Monday afternoon, and I mentioned last week that starting today, I was going to be doing something just a bit different. I hope that you'll continue to utilize the Lord's Prayer as well as various other things. For those basics, need to continue to guide us and sustain us and lead us forward. But what I would like to do is something a little bit different for the next several days, and that is that I would like to share with you something that I've been wanting to share with you for quite a long time, and that is I'm going to read for you part of this book, not certainly this whole thing, but one portion of it. This is the memoir of my great grandfather, William Recker. The one portion I want to read for you is about their experience homesteading out in Montana. For those of you who were here and engaged back prior to the sabbatical that I went on back in 2018, you'll know that the theme of the sabbatical was largely formed around him, my great grandfather, ways in which we were very similar and stuff. And since that time, I've wanted to read this memoir for you. It's not terribly long, but it is like 50 pages, and I could just never figure out a good time or place to do that. So I thought this would be a good opportunity, and there are a number of reasons that I'd like to do it. The first is, as I mentioned, I've always wanted to do it. I think it's a part of maybe even sharing related to the heritage of faith, which is the specific theme that we settled on, as you know, related to the sabbatical, and be able to share with you just a little bit more of my own heritage of faith through him and others. But much more than that. It's not just to share with you something from my family history, but I think the story is really good. I think he writes well, and I think you'll find it quote unquote entertaining to some degree. It's also very historical. It deals with, it's a firsthand account of the experience of homesteading in the early 20th century out in Montana. And so, from that perspective alone, it would be interesting historically, and particularly for those of you who are from the Dutch Reformed tradition or the Dutch Christian Reformed tradition, because it was a small group of Dutch Reformed people who were out there. I mean, they had lots of other people out there as well, and you'll pick that up in the story. But many of you may also have connections to those who were homesteading out west, so it may be interesting for you from that perspective as well. Beyond that, though, it deals with many issues that come out of the Lord's Prayer, or are as a part of the Lord's Prayer that we were looking at last week. You'll see that as the story unfolds also. And beyond that, just the general theme of God's people struggling. It really grapples with that, because that was their experience in large part. They did a lot of struggling, and it revealed good things, and it revealed not so good things as they went through those experiences. And so I think, as a reflection for ourselves in times where we're struggling a bit in terms of just the days that we're living through, I think it would be helpful and even encouraging for us as well. So, don't know exactly how many days this will take. Maybe 7, maybe 8. We'll see how it goes. I've only got 15 minutes a day to read, and I've already used 4 minutes and 29 seconds as an introduction. So anyway, the name of the memoir is called Wrong Side Up by William Recker. And chapter 1 is The Trek to the West Begins. It was very wet in the east in that spring of 1915, and the farmers of Illinois and Indiana were very much discouraged. It was a field day for the land agents and railroad companies of that day, for the ears of the farmers of the Middle West were fertile fields for the glowing word pictures that were painted by these men. Some honestly believed themselves and likened themselves to a Moses who would lead his people to the promised land. Glowing terms and pictures were used so that the people of the Middle West would pull their stakes and cross the Mississippi River to some far-off place in Montana or Wyoming, where they would not drown as they were doing that spring. Many folks were at once ready to go and see the big crops that were almost ready to harvest. As they gazed on their fields with furrows full of water and tomatoes barely peeking their heads over the water on some of the overflow land, they listened again to the agent when he came for the second or third time. They were told that for a small sum, home seeker tickets could be had for a party of 5 or 6 to go to see the promised land. It was added that on land costing from $10 to $15 an acre, crops of 40 to 45 bushels of wheat could be grown, and at the then prevailing price of 95 cents a bushel, it was easy to figure that instead of renters, they could all become landowners in a year or two. From then on, matters would be easy, and those who stayed behind in the East could raise their tomatoes, pickles, and cabbage, not to say anything of the onion weeding on knees, which was played up against riding on machinery. Goodbye to crawling on your hands and knees, they were told. Why not ride? The West was all ready for those homeseekers, and it seemed as though nature conspired with the land agents to have all things in readiness for them. Also, the West had abundant rain in that year, and the few fields of wheat or oats that a stray homesteader had put out was indeed a sight to thrill the heart of any farmer, and especially that of the Dutch farmer who, in his thoughts, went back to his native Holland where he had seen crops like that. The land in the West, being virgin soil, and having lain there untouched by man ever since creation, had grown sod to a depth of 6 inches and more. The buffalo grass and bunch grass covered the earth as far as the eye could see, and an occasional homesteader's shack was the only sign of human occupation. There were no fences or ditches, just one vast expanse of rolling prairie that one could gaze over until the snow-capped mountains stopped the view. The railroad companies had been granted the odd-numbered sections of land for 50 miles on each side of their right-of-way as a bonus for building these transcontinental lines. The even-numbered sections were retained by the government and were placed under the Homestead Act, enacted a few years previous to this. At the time of which we are speaking, vast sheep ranches and cattle ranches dotted the country, and they used all of these sections as free range. But they were slowly being forced to reduce their herds as the homesteaders drifted in and settled on these even-numbered sections. So in time, the land looked like a huge checkerboard, for the even-numbered were settled and the odd-numbered was railroad ground. These caused the sheep ranchers to buy up huge tracts of this railroad land to add to their range. They would also hire herders to take up homestead land on their range, and after 3 years, during which time the ranchers employed them, buy it from them. But slowly on, the fences built by the homesteader to protect his crops caused great inconvenience to the rancher, and thus vast holdings were offered for sale. It was on such a ranch that our friends from the East were told that their future was secure if they would only buy a section or a half section of land and farm as they had farmed back home. Land companies were formed in the West, which had their agents in the East and Middle West, who in turn worked on the renters and progressive sons of farmers to become ranchers in their own right. A few of these home-seeker parties were finally induced to make the trip and were royally welcomed by a representative of the land company at the best hotel in town, which was their first day's home. The auto had come into use by this time, and it also played into the hands of these agents. These lands were mostly uplands, being from 20 to 30 miles from the railroad station. Thus, parties were taken by auto to view these lands, and not having autos of their own, They little realized that in a short time they were 20 or 30 miles from the hotel. The hills also seemed lower and not so long or hard to climb because these drivers knew the roads and tried to get there in the shortest time possible. Usually, settlers were notified in advance to be ready to feed the home seekers and were promised a commission on any sales made. They would help the agent in their praise of the country and tell how easy it was to become an independent farmer or grain grower. Thus did some of the settlers work together with the land agent with the added hope that their homestead would become more valuable if the entire country was settled. In this way, some were talked into a section or a half section of land, and after taking pictures of the growing crops, they returned to the east to tell their families and friends that they were going west. No, not to become rich, as some accused them, but to become owners of a piece of land and to get away from gardening or milking cows. It was so much easier to farm in the West. Why should one crawl on the ground when one could ride on a machine? As the season was too late for spring crops, plans were laid to send sons ahead to break the ground and plant winter wheat, so that when the families arrived, a crop would be on the land from which immediate income would be had. Some families grouped and pooled their sons together so that they could live together and work together, thereby saving expense by procuring one tractor instead of two. It was also cheaper to send two parties in one immigrant boxcar than for each party to go separately. So after much talking and planning, the first car was about to be loaded, thus breaking the ice and beginning the establishment of a new settlement where soon a church building would be built and a minister would be called. If they would only hurry and get there, the rest would be easy. We shall now follow a pair of these sons as they prepared to leave for the land which their fathers had bought and which they were also eager to see. The fathers had told of the wonders of the West, and now finally the first car, loaded on the siding, was ready to leave. Chapter 2, Some Difficulties. 4 horses, 2 cows, and 5 little pigs were the animals that were the first to go west, along with some household goods, farm tools, and equipment. A small laundry stove was to serve as heater and cook stove, and also one bed was thought to be enough at first. In addition, plenty of blankets and food were also included in the first load. 2 young men were to go, Bud, the son of one of the purchasers, and myself. Bud had 2 years of college, and I had been employed in a factory. These were not exactly the proper qualifications in a factory for a pioneer, you might say, but we both had that stimulating spirit of the Eastern editor who said, "Go west, young man, go west." The horses and cows had been tested on the farm where they were raised and had been found free of disease. But soon the difficulty of transportation came upon us. As only one man was permitted to accompany a boxcar, it was agreed that we would take turns in being the one in whose name the contract with the railroad was made. If difficulties arose, the one who was caught would leave and take a passenger car to the destined point. All went well until the Chicago stockyards were reached, where, owing to the scourge of the hoof and mouth disease, all cars that contained livestock were sent for inspection. On arriving at the yards, we were told that the inspection, which had been made at home, did not suffice. Therefore, they would test the horses for glanders, the cows for tuberculosis, and the inspector said, "Pigs are out. Nothing doing on the pigs, for they are the worst carriers of disease there are. No, boys, you must absolutely get rid of the hogs." "He can't do that to us," said our educated college man. "We will call Montana and see what they say." So a telegram was sent to the state veterinarian of Montana, who wired back the following message: "We will take the hogs and horses, but no cattle, unless found all right by the yards inspector." This business took 3 days, and still we pondered the matter of how we would get our 2 cows and 5 little pigs out of Chicago to the ranch. Bud said, "I know what we'll do, for we will take a chance." "What do you mean by taking a chance?" I said. He replied, "Get rid of the pigs, or else stay here until we do, for you can't bluff that fellow. We will let the pigs decide this for themselves, for we'll open the crate, and if they jump out of the car, they're gone. But if they crawl under the freight, we'll sneak them through. That's fair, isn't it?" "Yes," I said. "But what if we get caught?" Then we'll have to unload the whole car to get those pigs out from under all that junk.